By late 1943, the tide of the Pacific War had begun to turn. Japan's rapid expansion across the Pacific had been halted after decisive defeats at Midway and the Coral Sea. Meanwhile, General Douglas MacArthur's forces pushed steadily through New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States had seized the strategic initiative. The next challenge was reaching Japan itself. Between Allied forces and the Japanese mainland lay thousands of miles of ocean scattered with heavily fortified islands. Rather than attacking every enemy stronghold, Admiral Chester Nimitz proposed a bold strategy known as island hopping. Instead of capturing every island, American forces would seize only those with strategic value, using them as air and naval bases while isolating the remaining Japanese garrisons. The strategy's first major test would be the Gilbert Islands, where a tiny coral island named Betio, part of Tarawa Atoll, stood directly in the path toward the Marshall Islands. Though only 3.5 kilometers long, its airfield made it one of Japan's most valuable defensive positions in the Central Pacific. The Japanese knew its importance. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki transformed Betio into a fortress. Reinforced bunkers built from concrete and coral covered the island. Coastal guns protected every approach, while trenches, machine gun positions, and underwater obstacles created overlapping fields of fire. Nearly 5,000 defenders prepared for the invasion, and Shibazaki confidently claimed that 1 million men could not capture Tarawa in 100 years. American intelligence identified many of the island's defenses through aerial reconnaissance and information from former British residents, but critical details remained unknown. Hidden bunkers escaped detection, and planners underestimated the coral reef surrounding the island, an error that would soon prove disastrous. On November 20, 1943, Operation Galvanic began. Thousands of Marines, supported by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft carriers, and hundreds of landing craft, launched one of the largest amphibious assaults the United States had attempted during the war. The invasion plan appeared simple. A powerful naval bombardment would destroy Japanese defenses before amphibious tractors carried the first assault waves directly onto the beaches. Conventional landing craft would then bring in reinforcements to secure the island. Before dawn, American warships unleashed a massive bombardment. Smoke and fire engulfed the tiny island, convincing many Marines that no defender could have survived. But the Japanese had built deep, reinforced bunkers that withstood much of the shelling. As soon as the bombardment lifted, hundreds of defenders returned to their firing positions and waited. Around 9 a.m., the first wave of amphibious tractors crossed the lagoon toward Betio. For a brief moment, everything seemed to go according to plan. Then the island erupted. Machine guns, mortar, artillery, and anti-boat weapons opened fire almost simultaneously. Bullets ripped through the thin armor of the landing vehicles while explosions filled the lagoon with water and debris. Many Marines were entering combat for the first time, and within minutes they found themselves trapped in one of the fiercest amphibious assaults in military history. Despite heavy losses, the first assault waves reached the beach, but the defenders had anticipated exactly where the Marines would seek cover. Mortar fire struck behind the seawall, forcing the attackers into open ground where hidden machine guns and snipers waited. Within minutes, the landing zones descended into chaos. Radios failed after being soaked with seawater. Officers were killed before they could organize their men, and landing craft drifted off course under relentless fire. The worst, however, was still to come. As the first Marines fought desperately to establish a foothold, an even greater disaster unfolded. Offshore, the invasion depended on conventional landing craft, carrying thousands of reinforcements across the coral reef surrounding Betio. Intelligence had predicted enough water for the boats to cross safely. Instead, an unusually low tide left the reef almost completely exposed. Hundreds of landing craft became stranded several hundred meters from shore. The Marines had no choice but to climb into the water and continue on foot. Carrying rifles above their heads and packs weighing more than 70 pounds, they waded through waist and chest-deep water toward the beaches. With no cover, they became easy targets. Japanese machine gunners opened fire immediately. Bullets, mortar rounds, and artillery shells tore through the exposed columns of Marines. Men fell into the lagoon while others struggled forward, dragging wounded comrades through the water. Destroyed landing craft, abandoned equipment, and floating bodies quickly covered the reef. Survivors later recalled that the water turned pink with blood. For many Marines, reaching the beach became the hardest battle of their lives. Those who finally made it ashore discovered that the Japanese defenses were far stronger than expected. Hidden bunkers continued firing from every direction, while snipers targeted officers, radio operators, and anyone attempting to organize the scattered units. Communication nearly collapsed. Many radios had been ruined by seawater before the troops even reached land, and reports reaching headquarters were confusing and often outdated. One desperate message summed up the situation: "We have landed." Casualties 70%. Can't hold. Although the report overstated the overall losses, it reflected the desperation on the beaches. For several hours, the invasion stood on the edge of failure. What prevented disaster was leadership. Colonel David Shoup repeatedly crossed the fire-swept beaches, gathering scattered units and directing attacks wherever they were needed most. With communications failing, he relied on runners, hand signals, and personal example. Small groups of Marines began clearing Japanese positions one by one. Flamethrowers blasted bunker openings. Combat engineers placed demolition charges against reinforced walls. And Sherman tanks, once they finally reached the island, destroyed strongpoints blocking the advance. Progress was painfully slow. Every bunker became a separate battle. Every trench had to be cleared before the Marines could move forward. After an entire day of fighting, nearly 5,000 Marines had landed, yet they had advanced only a few hundred meters inland. As night approached, American commanders feared a massive Japanese counterattack. Military doctrine called for powerful nighttime assaults that could drive the exhausted Marines back into the sea, but fate intervened. Earlier that afternoon, an American naval shell struck the Japanese command post, killing Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki before he could coordinate a full counterattack. Without his leadership, the expected assault never came. Instead, the Marines endured only scattered attacks and sniper fire through the night. They had survived the battle's most dangerous day. At dawn on November 21st, fresh reinforcements finally reached the island as the tide improved. Additional amphibious tractors and tanks strengthened the beachhead, allowing the Marines to shift from survival to attack, using tanks, flamethrowers, explosives, and close-range firepower. They advanced bunker by bunker across the narrow island. The fighting remained brutal. Japanese defenders refused to surrender, choosing instead to fight to the death or launch suicidal charges against American positions. By the end of the second day, the Marines had split Betio into two isolated sections, breaking the backbone of the island's defensive system. Yet fierce resistance continued, and the battle was still far from over. Before dawn on the third day, the remaining Japanese defenders launched one final banzai charge. Shouting battle cries, hundreds rushed toward the American lines in a desperate last attempt to break the beachhead. They were met by concentrated fire from machine guns, rifles, artillery, and tanks. Within minutes, the assault was destroyed, marking the end of organized Japanese resistance. Small pockets of defenders continued fighting from isolated bunkers, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. American engineers used explosives, flamethrowers, and even bulldozers to eliminate the last fortified positions. After 76 hours of nearly continuous combat, the Battle of Tarawa was finally over. The cost was staggering. In just 3 days, the United States suffered more than 3,400 casualties, including 1,117 Marines killed or missing and over 2,200 wounded. For many Americans, it was almost impossible to believe that such heavy losses had occurred on an island smaller than New York's Central Park. The Japanese garrison was virtually wiped out. Of nearly 4,850 defenders, about 4,690 were killed, while only a handful survived alongside a small number of Korean laborers forced to work on the island's defenses. At nearly the same time, American forces also captured nearby Makin Atoll, where resistance was much lighter. However, tragedy struck after the battle when the escort carrier USS Liscombe was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine, killing 687 American sailors in one of the deadliest single naval losses of the Pacific War. Back in the United States, Tarawa shocked the nation. For the first time, newspapers published graphic photographs of fallen American Marines lying on the beaches. The images revealed the true cost of the Pacific War and forced the public to confront the sacrifices still required to defeat Japan. Some military leaders questioned whether the victory had been worth such a terrible price. Others argued that the lessons learned at Tarawa would save thousands of lives in future operations. History proved them right. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps immediately reviewed every aspect of the battle. They recognized that amphibious tractors had performed far better than conventional landing craft, which had been stranded on the coral reef by the unexpected low tide. Future invasions would rely much more heavily on armored amphibious vehicles. Naval bombardments were also redesigned. Instead of ending hours before the landings, they would continue much closer to the assault, giving defenders far less time to recover. Coordination between warships and aircraft was improved. Communications were upgraded with better waterproof equipment and specialized underwater reconnaissance. Teams were created to identify reefs and destroy obstacles. Before invasion forces arrived, these improvements transformed American amphibious warfare. Only 2 months later, during the invasion of the Marshall Islands, the changes were already producing results. Longer bombardments, better intelligence, improved communications, and greater use of amphibious vehicles dramatically reduced American casualties while maintaining the momentum of the island-hopping campaign. From there, the United States continued advancing across the Central Pacific, bypassing many heavily defended Japanese bases while capturing only the islands needed to move closer to Japan. Each victory tightened the pressure on the Japanese Empire and brought Allied forces one step closer to the homeland. Tarawa became far more than a costly victory. It exposed weaknesses in planning, intelligence, logistics, and amphibious doctrine, but it also demonstrated America's ability to learn and adapt with remarkable speed. The lessons written in blood on the beaches of Battle shaped every major amphibious assault that followed, from the Marianas to Iwo Jima and Okinawa. For the Marines who crossed the coral reef under relentless fire, Tarawa would forever remain one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. For military historians, it remains a timeless reminder that victory does not belong to the side that never makes mistakes, but to the one that learns from them faster than its enemy. On a tiny strip of coral in the middle of the Pacific, the United States paid a terrible price. But from that sacrifice came the experience, doctrine, and confidence that carried Allied forces across the Pacific and ultimately to the doorstep of Japan. Tarawa was not the end of the Pacific War. It was the beginning of the final march toward victory.